Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to this NEH webinar on the Collaborative Research Program. I'm Judy Adkins. I'm a program officer in the Division of Research at NEH, and I serve as the team leader for the Collaborative Research Program. I'll be joined by two colleagues, Madison Hendren and Amy Trotter, who also work directly with the program. The three of us will be presenting today's webinar. I'll start us off, and Madison and Amy will be stepping in as we go along. During this presentation, we'll share essential information about the Collaborative Research Program and what it supports, advice for putting together a competitive application, and some tips to help you avoid common pitfalls. We'll speak for about 30 minutes. After our presentation, we'll have time for questions, so feel free to type questions in the chat as we go along. Because we're trying to keep the presentation portion tight, we won't pause for questions midstream, but after we speak, we'll go through the chat and answer as many questions as we can. If we run out of time and fail to answer yours, please reach out to us directly, and you will see our email addresses on the last slide of this presentation. Today's webinar will be recorded and later posted on the NEH website on the Collaborative Research Program page. NEH has funded hundreds of collaborative research projects over the years. You can look them up on the NEH website. At the very bottom of the homepage, you'll see a Search All Past Awards link. If you click on that, you can search by grant program as well as institution, date range, etc. This is an excellent way to get a first overall impression of the kinds of projects we've funded in this program. However, one word of caution is that the program has changed quite a bit over the years. So you'll see included certain categories of research that are now separated out into their own programs. For example, archaeological and ethnographic fieldwork, or scholarly editions and scholarly translations. And you'll also see in that database of past awards some bundled research agendas, which are quite different from the discrete projects that we now support. So take a look at the past awards database to get a sense, but do remember to attend to the current notice of funding opportunity. For those of you not very familiar with NEH, we're an agency of the federal government, and we carry out our grant making through 6 divisions: public programs, preservation and access, education, Office of Digital Humanities, challenge grants, and research. Each division offers grant programs that support different kinds of work or serve different goals. This is important to keep in mind because it has a bearing on the overall purpose of the Collaborative Research Program and the kinds of work that we support. The Division of Research program supports humanities research by individuals and by teams. So we run about 11 different grant programs split into 2 overall families. One family of programs is designed for individual scholars. These are programs like the NEH Fellowships or the NEH Summer Stipends. The other programs, like Collaborative Research, largely support teams of researchers and are institutional grants. This means that if you are the lead scholar who is the project director of a collaborative research project, it is your affiliated institution that is the official applicant and holder of the award. Here's the big picture overview of the Collaborative Research Program. The program supports teams of scholars working to advance humanities knowledge through research that leads to tangible interpretive products. It includes 4 funding categories, which support projects of different types or at different stages of development. And the 4 project categories are there for you to see. As you can see, there are different award ceilings and different performance periods for the different categories, and we'll dig into each category more deeply in just a moment. You can propose interdisciplinary work or research in a single field. You can include on your team researchers from the natural or social sciences, as long as the project is firmly rooted in the humanities, addresses humanities research questions, and employs humanistic methods. Partnerships among different kinds of institutions, and different kinds of institutions are also welcome. The rationale between the 4 categories is to support the kinds of collaborative work that most humanities scholars are doing. We are also trying to hit a certain programmatic sweet spot that allows for flexibility in terms of the kinds of work that scholars can propose, but also encourages well-defined, well-conceptualized projects with concrete outcomes. This year's application deadline is November 30th, 2022, and the earliest start date for awarded projects for this next cycle would be October 1, 2023. As I mentioned, these are institutional grants. And so that means that the institution is the applicant and the grant holder, and it's important to know which kinds of institutions can actually apply. So here is kind of the list of that. It includes nonprofit organizations, institutions of higher ed, and US state and local governments and their agencies, as well as tribal governments. So multiple institutions or scholars at multiple institutions can collaborate. So in that case, you would have an applicant institution, that is the home institution of your project director. And then if you have collaborating scholars at other US institutions, those institutions could be subawardees on the grant. What kinds of activities and products do collaborative research grants fund? The program supports the work that most scholars do, such as travel to archives or important research sites. Right, so we support travel to archives, that sort of thing, time to meet, conduct research, and write in order to produce books, digital projects, or other materials that will have an impact on the scholarship in their field or fields, and possibly beyond academia as well. All projects, regardless of project category, must pursue clearly articulated research questions, must involve original research and interpretation, and must make an argument or arguments and contribute something substantial to scholarly conversations or broader public conversations. Ultimately, all projects need to be aimed at the creation of a tangible, sustainable, interpretive product. Before we get to that, it's equally important to know and to be mindful of what the program does not fund. So we don't want folks wasting precious time and effort applying for projects that we cannot support. On this slide is a rather long list of funding restrictions for the program. I'm not going to go through it item by item. The list is in the notice of funding opportunity for the program, but it's kind of late in that document. It's at page 30, 31. So I'm just kind of pointing it out so that you won't gloss over it. You should look at it carefully and early in your thought and planning process. Some activities or kinds of work are on this list because they're funded by NEH, but in a different grant program. So that's the case with documentary films, exhibitions, scholarly editions, and scholarly translations, digitizations of collections, and some other kinds of work. Other activities are on this list because they are endeavors that NEH never funds. That's the case with the creation of art, say, or the support of specific public policies or legislation. So just read the list carefully and ask us questions if you're not sure whether what you're proposing runs into one of these prohibitions. Now let's dig into the details of the 4 funding categories, starting with the Planning International Collaboration category. This is our smallest grant offering in the program, and it's intended for early stage projects. The goal is to encourage international collaborations and lend them some extra early support, given the added complexities of developing these projects. To apply, your collaboration must include at least one non-US scholar. That could be a scholar based at an institution outside the US, most commonly, or it could be an independent scholar living abroad. However, scholars at US institutions must also contribute significantly to the project. Examples of funded activities include research time to correspond and exchange ideas through video, joint travel to a relevant site, archive, library, or collection to do research, and investigate a project's feasibility, exploratory workshops or working group meetings for collaborators, and completing a written research and future publication plan. Note that even for these planning projects, you need research questions to be sort of significant research questions to be driving the project. So even for these early stages, you have to have some very compelling research questions at the heart of the project. Primary products for these awards include a written plan for subsequent collaborative research activities and future publication or digital projects, live streamed or recorded video of workshops, web posted papers, podcasts, blogs, etc. And keep in mind that while these kinds of primary products would be the immediate outcome of the planning grant, you'd still need to be aiming down the road for a larger collaborative publication or digital project. You can request a maximum of 25K in this category, and the performance period can be anywhere from 6 to 12 months. For all project categories except the Planning International Collaboration grants, the maximum amount you can ask for is prorated on a monthly basis depending on your requested period of performance. I'll say more about that when we talk about the other categories, but just so you know, for these planning grants alone, the prorating doesn't apply. So if you have, say, 25K worth of eligible expenses, you can ask for that even if you are only doing a 6-month project. Moving along now to the convening category. This is renamed from last year's conference category for those of you who applied last year or are familiar with last year's notice of funding opportunity. The convening category supports a single scholarly conference, symposium, or seminar, or up to 2 working group meetings. What's new this year is the addition of the working group option, just to give scholars who need to do focused work with a small group of people, maybe on a collection of sources or at a particular site, the option of a more appropriate format for that kind of work. But you can still propose a conference or symposium. The aim of convening grants is to gather participants to further develop an already established collaborative research topic or project and plan subsequent publications or digital projects. So here again, there needs to be a larger, tangible, collaborative product that you're working towards. The convening needs to serve that end and not, say, education or community building or some other purpose. A conference or symposium must be open to members of an intellectual community broader than the invited attendees. It must be advertised appropriately, and it must be free of charge. It should include a variety of scholars bringing different points of view. Working group meetings can be for the collaborators alone, if it's necessary for the work, but you need to explain why that's necessary for the particular work that you're proposing to do. Typical funding requests in this category include compensation for the organizing scholar or scholars, travel, per diem, accommodation, and honoraria for conference presenters or working group participants, and costs related to venue rental or audiovisual services. Primary products for these awards include live streamed or recorded video of the convening itself, web posted papers, podcasts, blogs, etc., and preparation of papers or other content for subsequent edited volumes, peer-reviewed articles, etc. You can request a performance period of 1 year or less, and the maximum amount you can request for a full year is 50K. Here, the max amount you can request is prorated by month, depending on your requested period of performance. So, for example, if you propose a 6-month project, you could ask for a max of only 25K. As I said, a few things are new here this year with this category. In addition to the renaming of it to convening and the additional option of working group gatherings, this is now strictly a 1-year grant. So last year, applicants had the applicants had the option of asking for a 2nd year of support. That add-on no longer exists. So this is a 1-year grant now. Moving on now to the manuscript preparation category. This category supports the completion of collaborative manuscripts in preparation for print publication. Examples include co- or multi-authored monographs or edited volumes, a series of peer-reviewed articles, and themed issues of peer-reviewed journals. Typical funding requests include compensation for research and writing time, travel for the collaborators to a relevant site, archive, library, or collection to do research, and compensation for necessary consultants. Submission to the publisher is expected by the end of the performance period. So these grants are considered completion grants, but that completion can include a combination of research and writing. Competitive applications in this category typically convey a sense of the argument or arguments and the interventions, the structure of the book, which publishers are appropriate, and include a substantive chapter summary. These projects have a performance period of 1 to 3 years. You may request up to 100K per year for each of the first 2 years, and no more than 250K total for 3 years. Here again, these awards are prorated by month. So as an example, if you ask for a performance period of 1.5 years, that would be 18 months, you could ask for a maximum of 150K. The Scholarly Digital Projects category supports the preparation of born digital scholarly publications, resources, or tools. All projects must be conceived and executed to address one or more significant research questions. They must make a robust interpretive contribution. They must involve original research, and they must serve an intellectual community beyond the collaborator alone. These proposals typically involve scholars collaborating with DH, that's digital humanities specialists, librarians, and/or archivists. They typically use pre-existing platforms, programs, or other technological infrastructure. So tech innovation is not required or expected for these projects. It's fine to use tried and true DH methods, though you should be aware of and follow DH best practices. Possible products include digital publications, open access databases with significant interpretive content, GIS mapping projects, and content-rich websites. Applications in this category must present a long-term sustainability plan and discuss options for peer review. Typical funding requests include compensation for time to conduct research, and build a digital project, travel for collaborators to a relevant site, archive, library, or collection to do research, and compensation for consultants. There are several other NEH programs that support digital projects. So make sure you're applying to the program that best fits your endeavor. To that end, please do also take a look at the programs offered by the NEH Office of Digital Humanities. Please look at their program page and their offerings, and the NEH Division of Public Programs, because there are a lot of different programs that potentially support digital projects. If you have any questions, if your project is a good fit, of course, please do ask us. These awards have a performance period of 1 to 3 years. You can request up to 100K per year for each of the first 2 years, and the max you can request for a 3-year award period is 250. Here again, these awards are prorated by month. So same example I used before, if you were doing a 1.5 year project, 18 months, you could ask for a maximum of 150K. That concludes the basic overview of the work the program supports through these 4 categories. I'm going to pass the baton now to my colleague, Madison Hendred, also a program officer in the Division of Research, who is going to talk a little bit about what makes for a competitive application and some tips for avoiding common pitfalls.
Thank you, Judy, and welcome everyone. So as Judy mentioned, we're going to kind of shift gears here a little bit and talk about some tips for getting started and preparing your application. I like to start by showing, by giving you a sense of the timeline of your application from when you submit it and through notification so that you can plan ahead. The federal grant process is long, about 9 months for the collaborative research program. As Judy mentioned, applications are due by November 30th of 2022. Peer review panels will meet in March and April of 2023. And NEH's National Council on the Humanities will review funding recommendations which are based on peer review in July of 2023. The chair of the endowment will make the final funding decisions shortly thereafter, and notifications to applicants will be sent out in early August of 2023. The earliest start date, as Judy also mentioned, for applications submitted to the 2022 deadline will be October 1st, 2023, and the latest start date is September 1st, 2024. You'll want to keep this cycle in mind as you plan and propose your project. Okay, so where to start? As Judy has mentioned several times, the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, is a really very important document, and you can find that on the program page of the NEH website. every program at NEH has its own NOFO, which essentially is the blueprint or guidelines for everything about the program, what the program supports and does not support, how to apply, how to write, structure, and format the different components of the application, what the review criteria are for the program, and more. The current collaborative research NOFO and FAQ documents are available, like I said, on the program page, and I cannot emphasize enough the importance of reading the entire NOFO carefully from start to finish before you decide to apply, and then consulting it continually while you're writing and assembling the different parts of the application. This is particularly important for this program because there are these different project categories with so many different distinctions among them. Different parts of the NOFO break out those different categories and ask you to supply different kinds of information depending on which category you're applying for. It's admittedly dry reading, but successful applicants are usually people who read and follow the NOFO. On that first read of the NOFO, you're going to want to pay special attention to section A1, the purpose, in the program description section to clarify which category fits the needs of your project. You'll also want to compare your ideas with D6 funding restrictions to make sure you're not applying for activities or costs that are not allowed in this program. Consider the information about related funding opportunities to make sure that this program is in fact the best fit for your project or the part of your project for which you are seeking funding. And also take a look at the other eligibility information as you select your project team. From there, you'll want to familiarize yourself with the content and form of the application submission section to craft a compelling presentation of your project significance and content, and note the required and conditionally required components that apply to your project and the category that you wish to apply to. I'll speak a little bit more about those in just a minute. You'll also want to read the review criteria and keep them in mind and refer to them as you craft your application to make sure that you address all 5 criteria throughout the application. You'll also want to partner with your research development office as they will help you with some components of the application, especially the budget, federal compliance issues, and they will help you with proposal submission as well. So you'll want to get in touch with them early on. And also consider submitting a draft. These are optional, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a bit. But that deadline is September 15th, and it's a good opportunity to get some early feedback on your project. Okay, so a word about those NOFO guidelines. I mentioned you'll want to familiarize yourself with the content and form of the application section of the NOFO. You'll want to return to this section often as well, but there is some new language in the NOFO this year, so I wanted to just talk about that and give you a sense of what to expect. It's very, very important that that you be familiar with this part because, as I said, there are required and conditionally required components, and NEH does not review applications that are missing any required or relevant conditionally required components. New this year is language about page limits for those requirements. So all the established page limits will either be labeled as mandatory or suggested. We cannot review applications that include components that exceed the mandatory page limits. This is very, very rigid, and we cannot make any exceptions. So you're going to want to double check those. There is a bit more flexibility with suggested page limits. However, we ask that you adhere to those as diligently as the mandatory ones. An excess page or two will not, for those components, will not render your application ineligible. This is really to avoid a common clerical error that typically occurred with when people combined CVs into one PDF, to avoid them from being thrown out as ineligible when otherwise they were fine. But if we do get too many applications with very long CVs over that suggested 2-page limit, we might have to tighten the rules. So please do check to make sure that your application and all the components comply with those page limits before you submit. Okay, because we get so many questions about international collaborators, I do want to take a minute to talk about this as well and provide some clarification. Non-US based collaborators are allowed, and at least one is required in the planning and international collaboration category. They are not required, but certainly welcome in the other 3 categories. Collaborative research budgets can ask for support for non-US based collaborators, but no funds can go to a non-US institution. So non-US based collaborators are typically paid individually as consultants. NEH is a US federal agency, and any collaboration proposed must significantly involve US scholars. A section of the NOFO mentions that the US applicant institution cannot be essentially a pass-through entity, but must contribute significantly to the project. So just be aware that if you had, say, one US scholar and otherwise all non-US scholars or other participants, and the budget had most of the funds going to these non-US scholars, some questions could be raised about that. All right, so we're going to move on now to some overall advice for writing a competitive application for this program, and then I'll go through some common pitfalls as well. First, we're still seeing some bundled projects because the program used to allow for that, but as Judy has discussed, now you must apply for one and only one of those 4 project types. The second bullet item here is making a similar point. The program is geared towards well-conceived, well-structured, feasible projects rather than kind of hydra-headed, sprawling agendas. There is a section of the application, the narrative called The History of the Project, and you'll see that the instructions in the NOFO invite you to convey the evolution of the project, both its history and where you see it going after the proposed grant period. And that's a good place to describe not only how the project and collaboration has evolved to this point, but also your larger agenda going forward, which might include many components and kind of ancillary parts. Describing that larger research agenda there is fine, and that can help panelists assess the significance and impact of the immediate project. But remember that panelists are asked to evaluate the specific proposed project, and that should really be the focus of the application, and the work activities and budget should all serve that immediate project, which should fit into that project category. Next, we want to underscore that this is a program that calls for original research in the pursuit of significant research questions, and the application should reflect that. It's important to articulate the questions at the heart of the project and communicate how pursuing those questions will drive the field or fields forward. Related to that point, the intellectual significance is always the first among equals in the review criteria for grant programs in the research division. So you really need to make the case and show or explain to the panelists how your work is going to make a significant contribution. So which scholarly debates or conversations is your project entering into, and how are your research and conclusions going to move them forward or add a crucial new perspective? You need to make a strong case that is also convincing. Next, competitive proposals tend to get the peer review panelists excited about the intellectual possibilities of the collaboration itself. You want to convince the panelists that something is going to happen here intellectually with these people working together that wouldn't otherwise happen. Successful teams give careful consideration to how the actual structure will generate that collaborative synergy. Applications do better if they show some sort of intentionality about the structure of the work processes and how that structure is designed to lead to cross-fertilization of ideas or, like I said, a synergy of skill sets. This is important. Don't shortchange the work plan. Give panelists confidence that you have a well thought out plan to get the work done. The plan should not come across as vague or just kind of trust me sort of plan. You want it to, like I said, be very intentional. Always you want to write clearly and avoid jargon. Write for those outside your field. On the panel that reviews your application, there will likely be a specialist, but there will also very likely be non-specialists from outside your field that review your application. And you will need to be able to speak to both of those. Ask yourself, am I so immersed in my field that I no longer know what an outsider would consider jargon, things like that. We always recommend having someone outside your discipline or perhaps even outside the academy read your application and tell you where they got confused, things like that. That can be very helpful. And as I've already mentioned, submit a draft and start early. There are some resources on the website you may want to consult. We have some sample application narratives up there. I will say that they can be used as inspiration, but do keep in mind that they may have been submitted to a different NOFO, and the program could have been structured a little differently and had different requirements at that time. Also keep in mind that what worked for one project might not be best for yours. And also, if you have any questions about budget-related issues, you can contact our Office of Grant Management at grantmanagement@neh.gov. Okay, speaking of those drafts, which we've mentioned several times now, let me tell you just a little bit more about how the draft process works in this program. You may submit a draft for feedback. This, like I said earlier, is completely optional. It's not required and has no bearing on the eventual review process of your application, but applicants have found it helpful. If you wish to submit a draft, you must use the draft template, which is available under Program Resources on the Collaborative Research Program page of the NEH website. Here I've got a little shot of that template so you get a sense of kind of how it's laid out. You'll want to download the template and copy and paste your text in. You're going to want to choose only one project category, and please respect the word limits that you see there. Draft is a bit of a misnomer for this program. The template really is more of a snapshot of your project, but generally it gives us plenty of information for staff to comment on the fit of your project to a particular category, to highlight any potential issues, and to offer some helpful feedback. And it prompts you to get started and zero in on the essentials of your project. There's also a place on the template for you to pose specific questions that you have for us as we read and respond to your draft. We can accept only one draft per project. And to submit that draft, you're just going to email the completed template to collaborative@neh.gov. As you can see, it's that address is there on the template as well, with collaborative research draft in the subject line of the message, no later than September 15th. In general, we do not accept late drafts. Our goal then is to get to respond to all drafts by October 17th. Okay, so some common pitfalls to avoid. The first is scholarly digital projects with little or underdescribed interpretive content. So again, that's one of the most important aspects of this program. So you want to make sure that comes through. Scholarly digital projects without driving research questions, and scholarly digital projects without plans for sustainability beyond the grant period. In the convenings category, occasionally we see applications that don't give a clear indication that invited scholars have agreed to participate. And in manuscript preparation projects, occasionally we see projects or applications that fail to articulate the central arguments and how those arguments will play out through individual chapters or contributions. Some more technical kind of problems that or pitfalls that we tend to see is inclusion of a degree candidate on the team as a project director, co-project director, or the sole collaborator of a two-person team. Degree candidates can serve as other roles on the team, just not those three. Like I said, exceeding mandatory page limits or formatting errors that result in the above. Occasionally, when you convert files from a document to PDF, some content will slip on to the next page, and even in those cases, unfortunately, we cannot make exceptions to those mandatory page limits. So again, you do really want to double check your application before you submit it, make sure that it's within those limits. Funding requests for disallowed activities, most commonly the creation of art, be it poetry, fiction, dance, memoirs, creative nonfiction, or attendance at a regularly occurring academic conference, subawards to foreign institutions, and the use of incorrect indirect cost rates. Now that last one will not impact the review of your application or eligibility, anything like that, but it could result in a lowered award amount should your application be successful. So just something to be aware of and bring up with your institutional grant administrator as you're crafting your application and putting it together. All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation, and we are ready and have time to address your questions. So Amy, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Madison. We have a few questions in the chat. The first one that came through, they're asking for an explanation for the difference between eligible tech support and ineligible innovative methods and infrastructure.
Sure, I guess I'll jump into that one. So on the funding restriction list, it says projects that are primarily aimed at kind of developing sort of new digital humanities, sort of like really developing the technology. The reason that's on there is because there are grant programs that specifically support that in the Office of Digital Humanities. So that's what that funding restriction is about. That doesn't apply to you, say, doing a digital project, but having a consultant on the project or a team member who is themselves a DH expert and is providing you technical expertise. You can definitely have those team members, and indeed, virtually all digital projects really do kind of need that expertise. So that funding restriction is specifically about a kind of project that's aimed at technological innovation, which is not supported in this program. Hope that makes sense.
All right.
Yeah, I think.
Go ahead.
And I just to add, it really gets back to those research questions and the interpretive component. There has to be that interpretive component that the technology is allowing for the project to be eligible in this program, not just kind of innovation for future use by other scholars. That can't be the only kind of driver of the project for this program.
I'm just going to pipe up and say, if we've misinterpreted your question, feel free to, again, shoot us an email after the fact, and we're going to try to understand them correctly, but I'm sure we're getting some of this wrong. Okay, Amy, sorry.
That's okay. There was a follow-up to that, which is, can the tech be innovative and that it allows us to create our interpretive product? For instance, they can't build their website without new technology.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, it can be innovative, but it's kind of going to be a balance. So if the sort of new contribution is the sort of technical innovation, and that's really the focus, and they're not sort of like new arguments being made about sort of the other humanities content, then that might fit more with ODH. But if you're developing some new tools and that is tied directly to your answering sort of larger questions in sort of broader humanities fields beyond DH itself, then that would be potentially a good fit. And yeah, this might be a project where you might want to submit us a draft and then also talk to the folks in ODH and make sure we can get your project in the best place.
All right, moving on to the next question. Is it possible to include tribal organizations outside of the U.S.?
So the applicant institution has to be a sort of federally recognized tribal organization. And so I don't know exactly what you're asking, but you can collaborate with institutions outside the US. You just can't have money going with them. And one thing that confuses people a little bit is that part of your collaboration can be collaborating with an institution that could not itself be an applicant institution. And you can collaborate with institutions outside of the US, they just can't receive funding.
Right.
Again, if you want to shoot us an email and provide sort of more specific information about which entity you're talking about, that might be helpful for us to know. There might be some research that we would need to do, but in general, you can collaborate with institutions outside of the U.S. You just can't have funding going to them.
Thanks, Judy. Can you clarify how you're defining scholars and institutions?
I don't think I follow the question. Madison, do you?
So I don't know if I understand it either. I think we've been saying scholars to mean participants on the grant, individuals, and the institution is the applicant, so the university, a nonprofit, a tribal organization, and the scholars are the individual collaborators on the project. I don't know if that helps though.
Thank you. We have another question. Would it be possible to organize an international conference outside of the USA, and can other funds be added later?
Yes, you can organize a conference outside of the US, but you'd have to explain why it needs to be outside the US. You'd have to kind of justify that, I think. You might have good reasons for that. We've definitely had projects do sort of working group meetings and workshops and things because there's a specific site they need to be working at, for example.
Can you repeat the second part of the question, Amy?
Yes. Can other funds be added later on? For instance, if the NEH has already granted $50,000, there might be other organizations that they want to apply through that have different deadlines.
You can, yeah, absolutely. You can apply to other organizations and have concurrent, funding for the project from organizations other than NEH. NEH would not provide additional funding for, it's possible to submit an application for a subsequent part of the project to this program, but that would be considered on its own merit but you couldn't come back for, you know, additional expenses that kind of beyond the ceiling or the original request from NEH.
Thank you. Another question is, can a proposal for a book have a digital component?
So sure. If you're planning a book and you also plan a sort of complementary website, you need to choose which is your primary product that you're going to work on, and that is the sort of category you would choose. So if what you're really doing is writing the book, but later on the line you're going to sort of like add a sort of complementary website, you know, you'd apply to do the book. And in your application should focus on the book. In that history of the project section, that's where you would say, after we complete this book and submit it to the publisher at the end of the grant period, we also have plans to do this digital website that goes with it. That way, that gives the panel some sense of your larger agenda. But again, you need to kind of choose, is this primarily a manuscript project right now that we're most ready to work on, and that's what we're going to do, and that's what we're going to ask for support for, or are we really working on the digital project, and that's the most sort of innovative thing, and that's what we're most sort of focused on right now. We recognize that some of the research you do for your book is going to feed into your website and vice versa. So that's fine, but you need to really kind of think about which specific product and project you are going to be most focused on and do during the grant period. And that's what you need to kind of apply for and do with the time and the funding that you receive from NEH for that project.
All right, thank you. Back up a little bit. Back to the question where they were looking for clarification between institution and scholar. They're asking if scholars need to be affiliated with institutions. For instance, do institutions have to be organizations of higher education?
So the project director does need to be affiliated with the applicant institution, but other participants, co-project director, contributors, other participants do not need to be affiliated with that institution or any institution. We can support, you know, independent scholars or other experts, other participants who are kind of unaffiliated. And do the institutions have to be organizations of higher education? No. So for the applicant institution, as Judy mentioned, it can be an institution of higher education, a 501c3 nonprofit tribal organization that's federally recognized, tribal government that's federally recognized, libraries, you know, other research centers, as long as they're 501c3 are eligible.
And state and local governmental agencies are also, yeah. So yeah, just to piggyback on what Madison was saying, yeah. So it's the applicant. So the institution that applies for the grant has to be an institution, and the PD is affiliated with that institution. But on your larger collaborative team, you can include a mix of people who are affiliated with other institutions, and you can include independent scholars, independent, you know, web designers, whatever, that kind of thing.
All right, this question is similarly related. Can a scholar at an institution in the Global South be a project co-director, even if their institution cannot be a sub-awardee?
I'm sorry, can you read that one more time?
Sure. Can a scholar at an institution in the Global South be a project co-director, even if their institution cannot be a sub-awardee?
They can be the co-director,
yes.
Not the project director, though, because the project director needs to be at the applicant institution, which needs to be, which can't be a foreign institution.
Yes, I concur.
Thank you. Can an institution apply for a convening grant, even if the convening will be hosted by another institution?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by hosted. Like, it can take place at a different institution. You can have the scholar who is planning, you know, scholar is at institution A is the one who's really kind of planning and the lead scholar on the project, but for various reasons, they want to have it actually take place at a different institution somewhere else. There could be reasons for plenty of reasons for that. So if you're talking about venue, yeah, I think that's what you're talking about. Or I think not you, Amy, but the questioner.
Thank you. Are images allowed with the draft submission?
No, I don't think we have a place in the template for images.
We don't, and I think to some extent, starting to sort of let people kind of add appendices would become a little bit of a can of worms. I also think that you should be able to describe, you know, I think that you should be able to sort of describe what the information that's necessary in the template, yeah, in text. So I think that we'll say no, that it's not in the template, and I think we'll stick with that.
Thanks. If a team member goes to a regularly occurring academic conference at their own expense, can they get funding for an extra day before or after to meet the person as a team?
So this, I feel like this comes up from time to time, and what we usually say is, you know, so for instance, if you're going to go to the conference anyway, you always go to that conference. The main reason to go there is to go to the conference. You shouldn't ask for travel funds to go to that place. But if you are adding on work with collaborators, because they're all going to happen to be there, and you do want to stay a day on the other side of the conference, and you want to ask for accommodation for that kind of group meeting there, I think that would be acceptable. Some of these things would be kind of decided ultimately by our Office of Grant Management that picks through budgets and sort of really kind of figures it out. And usually, you know, if there's a small item that's disallowed, it's not going to really render your entire application ineligible. It might cut down on the amount of funding you receive, or you might have to revise the budget if there's just a few little things that are problematic. But in general, you wouldn't want to charge travel to the conference just because you're doing an additional thing there, if really the main point for you to go to the conference was to go to the conference.
Thank you. Just to back up, we did have someone ask if images can be included with the application and not the draft.
Yes, they can be included either as part of the narrative, but again, that would have to fit within those page limits, the 11-page limit for the narrative. Or I believe they could also be included as an appendix. But again, that would have to fit within the page limits allowed for appendices, along with the other required appendices for the category.
Thank you. We have a question asking if one of two co-directors, if, for example, if I am one of two co-directors, would the award be made to the two different institutions?
So the award,
go ahead,
Judy.
Go ahead.
The award would be made to the applicant institution, but they could include a sub-award to the institution of the co-project director. But technically the award would be made to the one applicant institution that's with which the PD is affiliated.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in to say people often want to have two co-directors to really kind of emphasize that they're equals, but for the purposes of these grants, you got to choose one person to be the applicant institution, and that person is officially, for NEH purposes, the project director, and then the other person is the co-director, even if they really are kind of co-equals in terms of their intellectual leadership on the project. So.
Thank you. We have another question asking if a project that involves digital analysis of a text corpus and intends to publish those results as part of the outcomes, but otherwise would produce articles and volume, would they be better suited for manuscript preparation or digital scholarship category?
This seems like one where you should submit a draft and explain the project in more detail, and also talk to us if yeah, also reach out to us and tell us more of the specifics.
Thanks. We have a question asking to clarify something about the budget. Is the budget, do they need a full budget, or is the program simply prorated by month?
You need to submit a budget that itemizes your costs. The proration, you just can't exceed either the ceiling amount for that funding category, and then if you have partial years, you have that ceiling would be prorated, but it's not like an automatic monthly kind of. You still need to submit the budget with your itemized costs, and yeah.
Maybe just one more here. I know we're coming up to the hour, and we do really like to keep these at the hour.
All right, I'll try to find some that are not specific to the project that they're asking about. If you have a question that's specific to your project, please be sure to email us. We can better answer them through that. We have someone that's asking if they have a better chance of receiving a $100,000 grant versus a $250,000 grant.
Sure. Yeah. So the main thing is that you should ask for the amount of time and the amount of money that's really kind of necessary for the program that you're proposing to do. That's kind of the thing that the review panelists think about is, is what they're proposing, the activities they're proposing, the sort of complexity and ambition of the project. Does that match with the kind of work activities and the budget? They're kind of looking at that. So it's not that you're like more likely to get funded if you ask for less money. It really is about that kind of fit, and that's what you should think about when you're planning your project and your application and how much you're going to ask for. Maybe one final question.
All right, we have probably 2 or 3 remaining questions in the chat, but if we want to just narrow it down, I would say we have a question regarding content. Do proposals that focus on humanities-related topics, arguments that draw theoretical and methodological guidance primarily from other fields fit this call?
Can you say it one more time?
Sure. He's asking if proposals that focus on humanities-related topics and arguments but draw theoretical and methodological guidance primarily from other fields, does that fit this grant?
Yes, potentially. I would suggest submitting a draft so we can get more specific about this project or send us an email. But yes, that will fit, and it's up to the applicant to demonstrate the significance and utility of those methodologies for humanities research. And to demonstrate how the questions they're asking will further their discipline and the field more broadly. But yes, we can accept projects that utilize methodologies from other fields.
Amy, did you say there was just 1 or 2 more questions that weren't highly specific? We could try to do those really quickly.
Yeah, there's one more that's broad enough, I believe, that we should address.
Okay.
For a nonprofit organization, does it have to be in existence for a certain amount of time, or can new nonprofits apply?
New nonprofits can apply, but you have to have, it has to be, I can't remember the sort of legalistic sort of like, it has to be fully established and have that sort of tax exempt status, whatever that process is. This is probably a question for the Office of Grant Management. I know we've had this question in the past. So it depends a little bit on what you mean kind of newly established. It does have to have kind of all the sort of legal, T's crossed and I's dotted.
And it has to be established at the time of application too.
Right, that's key, yeah.
And a quick follow-up to that was, is the collaboration between 2 or more entities a requirement?
No, collaborators can come from the same institution. I believe that's what the question is asking.
Yes, you can have 2 or more collaborators at the same institution. That's acceptable. Yeah, sure.
All right, I believe that's it for the questions. There were a few more that we weren't able to get to, but these are mostly project specific. So please, again, be sure to email us and we can further help you with those.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I think we should stop there. Please do, as Amy said, reach out again with questions about your projects. Also reach out by email if you have any comments or suggestions about either the Collaborative Research Program or future webinars. We always appreciate feedback. Thank you for your patience with our technical glitches today. I really appreciate that. On behalf of the NEH, thank you for attending this webinar. Thank you for your interest in the Collaborative Research Program. We hope to see many of you apply this year or in future years, and we wish you all the best with your scholarly endeavors. And have a good afternoon.